I am Zoe, 38, and my world collapsed when my son, Ethan, now 19, cut ties with me after I sided with his bully's parents 2 years ago. The most gut-wrenching moment of my life was finding his letter explaining he was moving in with his dad permanently because home should be where someone believes you. I now understand that my attempt to be fair to everyone without trusting my son first was my greatest parenting failure. I've learned the hardest way possible that fairness without belief is cruelty. Before I begin sharing my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please subscribe if you want more real stories about the painful lessons that changed lives forever. I grew up in a middle-class family in Portland, Oregon, where I was taught to always see both sides of every situation. This mindset eventually led me to become a high school counselor, specializing in bullying prevention. The irony of this isn't lost on me now. 5 years ago, my ex-husband Mark and I divorced. It was amicable, but painful for everyone involved. We worked out a co-parenting arrangement where Ethan primarily lived with me in our small but comfortable home in what realtors call an up-and-coming neighborhood, and he spent weekends with his father. Before the incident that changed everything, Ethan and I had what I thought was a close relationship. He was always a sensitive, artistic, and intelligent boy, though somewhat socially reserved. He preferred deep conversations with one or two friends rather than large social gatherings. His passion was photography and filmmaking, something he'd discovered in middle school when we got him his first real camera for his 13th birthday. After the divorce, I occasionally went on dates, but Ethan always came first. I was determined to give him stability and support during a difficult transition. My closest friend Jennifer, who worked at the same school as me, was my main support system during this time. She was there for late-night phone calls and emergency wine sessions when parenting a teenager became overwhelming. My parenting philosophy was always centered around open communication and honesty. I prided myself on creating a safe space where Ethan could tell me anything. At work, I had a reputation for being fair and balanced in my approach to student conflicts. I believed in hearing all sides before making judgments, a value my parents had instilled in me from childhood. When we moved to our new neighborhood after the divorce, it was specifically for the better school district. Westlake High School had an excellent academic reputation and a strong arts program that I thought would nurture Ethan's creative interests. I had some concerns about him adjusting to a new school as a freshman, but I believed his intelligence and talent would help him find his place. Change is an opportunity for growth, I told him on his first day at Westlake. Looking back, I recognize the privilege and naivety in that statement. I had no idea that the school I thought would open doors for my son would instead become a place of torment. My parents still live in Portland, about an hour away from us. They adore Ethan, but were sometimes critical of what they called my permissive parenting style. They believed in stricter boundaries than I did. Sometimes I wonder if having more structure would have somehow protected Ethan from what happened. But I know that's just searching for control in a situation where I had none. Our home wasn't fancy, but it was filled with Ethan's photography and art. I converted a small spare room into a dark room for him when he became interested in film photography. That room would later become a painful reminder of everything he left behind. I thought I was building a foundation of trust and support. I believed that my professional training made me especially equipped to guide my son through the challenges of adolescence. I was wrong in ways I couldn't have imagined. The first signs of trouble started shortly after Ethan began at Westlake High School as a freshman. Looking back, I can see the changes were happening right in front of me, but I somehow missed them or dismissed them as normal teenage adjustments. Ethan had always been an A and B student, but by the end of his first semester at Westlake, his grades were slipping. When I asked him about it, he shrugged and said the classes were harder than at his previous school. That seemed reasonable enough, so I offered to help him study or get tutoring. He declined, saying he would figure it out on his own. What bothers me more is how he gradually withdrew from photography, which had been his passion for years. The dark room I had created for him sat unused for weeks at a time. When I mentioned this, Ethan said he was just exploring other interests, but he never mentioned what those new interests might be. My attempts to communicate with him were increasingly met with vague responses or one-word answers. At the time, I chalked it up to teenage independence, even felt a bit proud that he was developing his own identity separate from me. I know now that his withdrawal was a cry for help that I completely misinterpreted. During the first parent-teacher conferences, several teachers mentioned that Ethan seemed distracted in class. His English teacher noted that his usually insightful contributions to discussions had become rare. His photography teacher expressed particular concern, saying Ethan had stopped submitting work altogether for several assignments. When I brought these comments up with Ethan, he dismissed them, saying the teachers were exaggerating. One day, I found Ethan's backpack in the laundry room with a long tear down one side. When I asked what happened, he said he caught it on a fence. The explanation seemed odd, but I didn't push for more information. I simply offered to buy him a new one, which he declined, saying he could fix it himself with duct tape. Ethan began to avoid school events entirely. Even the photography club showcase he had been excited about the previous semester. When I suggested we attend together, he became uncharacteristically angry, saying there was no point because his work wasn't good enough anyway. The self-doubt in his voice was new and troubling. Items began to go missing from Ethan's belongings. First, it was a special lens for his camera, then his favorite hoodie, and later, his graphing calculator. Each time he claimed to have lost them or left them at school. I remember feeling frustrated about the expense of replacing these items, but I never considered there might be a more sinister explanation. Mark and I had several conversations about our concerns. "He's just going through a phase," Mark suggested during one of our co-parenting check-ins. "Remember how we were at that age? Everything feels like the end of the world." I agreed, perhaps too readily. It was easier to believe this was normal teenage behavior than to consider alternatives that might require more difficult interventions. About 3 months into the school year, Ethan asked if he could switch schools. The request came out of nowhere during dinner one night. When I asked why, he mumbled something about not fitting in at Westlake. I explained that changing schools mid-year would be impractical and could potentially harm his academic record. I suggested he give it more time, make more of an effort to join clubs, and things would improve. The look of resignation on his face should have told me everything, but I missed it completely. I started noticing bruises on Ethan's arms and once a scrape along his jawline. When questioned, he attributed them to gym class or clumsiness. As a counselor, I should have recognized these as potential signs of bullying, but somehow I compartmentalized my professional knowledge when it came to my own son. My worry grew, but it competed with my professional opinion that teenagers need space to work through their problems independently. I was caught in the paradox of wanting to help while believing that overparenting would harm Ethan's development of resilience and problem-solving skills. I noticed Ethan had started taking alternate routes home from school and checking his phone with obvious anxiety whenever notifications came through. When I asked if everything was okay with his friends, he would quickly say yes and change the subject. There was one evening when Ethan almost opened up. We were making dinner together, something we used to enjoy doing as a team. He started to say something about some guys at school who were kind of intense, but my phone rang with a work emergency. By the time I finished the call, the moment had passed, and Ethan was back to one-word responses. I kick myself now for not seeing how important that moment could have been. In retrospect, I feel overwhelming guilt about missing the signs. As a school counselor who had trained others to identify bullying, I failed to see it happening to my own son. I was so concerned with giving him independence that I missed his silent pleas for intervention. Ethan began spending more time at Mark's house without explanation, sometimes asking to stay there on weeknights, which wasn't our usual arrangement. When I mentioned this pattern to Mark, he seemed surprised and said Ethan hadn't shared any specific reasons with him either. We both assumed it was just Ethan enjoying the different environment, or perhaps the more relaxed rules at his dad's place. By this point, I had a growing suspicion something was wrong, but I wasn't sure what action to take. I didn't want to overreact and invade Ethan's privacy if he was just going through normal teenage struggles. This hesitation, this benefit of the doubt I gave to the situation rather than to my son's changing behavior, would become my greatest regret. The moment everything changed was an ordinary Tuesday evening. I was taking out the trash when I noticed Ethan's camera in the garbage bin, its lens cracked and body dented as if it had been stomped on. This wasn't just any camera, but a semi-professional model he had saved for months to buy. I brought the damaged camera inside and confronted Ethan, who was in his room with the door closed as usual. When he saw what I was holding, something in him finally broke. Tears streaming down his face, he admitted what had been happening for months. He was being bullied relentlessly and viciously by 3 boys at school. "They take my stuff, they push me around, they text me awful things," he said between sobs. "They wait for me after school. They tell everyone not to talk to me. They ruined all my photos in the darkroom last week. That's why I stopped going to photography club." The boys had names Jason, Tyler, and Connor. As Ethan described the ongoing torment, I felt physically ill. The bullying included physical intimidation, destroying his property, and vicious cyberbullying that included threats and humiliating photoshopped images shared with other students. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I tried," he said quietly. "You were always busy, or you told me to handle it myself, or you said high school is just tough sometimes." His words hit me like a physical blow. He had been reaching out in his way, and I had missed every signal. I immediately promised to address the situation to make it stop to protect him, as I should have been doing all along. That night, I researched the 3 boys Ethan had named. What I discovered complicated matters significantly. Jason's father was on the school board. Connor's mother was the PTA president. Tyler's parents were both teachers at a neighboring school with close ties to Westlake's administration. These weren't just any families in the community. They were influential ones with deep connections to the school system where I worked. The next morning, I contacted Principal Reynolds, explaining the situation and requesting immediate intervention. His hesitation was palpable, even over the phone. "These are serious allegations, Ms. Parker," he said carefully. "The students you're naming come from very involved families. We'll need to proceed with caution and gather all the facts." His response bothered me, but I understood the political dynamics at play. Still, I insisted on action, making it clear that my son's well-being was at stake. We agreed to schedule a meeting with all parties involved for the following week, which felt too distant given what Ethan was enduring. But I accepted the timeline. Taking matters into my own hands, I decided to contact the parents directly. Each conversation followed a similar pattern, initial concern followed by defensive disbelief. "Jason would never bully anyone," his father asserted. "He's a leader, sure, but not a bully. Are you sure your son isn't misinterpreting normal teenage banter?" Connor's mother was more diplomatic but equally dismissive. "Connor has mentioned your son seems to have some difficulty fitting in. Perhaps this is more of a social skills issue than bullying." Tyler's mother suggested that Ethan might be fabricating these claims for attention due to our divorce. "Kids from broken homes often act out in these ways," she said with what sounded like practiced sympathy. Despite these discouraging responses, the meeting was set. I spent the days leading up to it gathering what evidence we had: screenshots of some text messages, photos of damaged property, and Ethan's detailed account of incidents with dates and times. Ethan was extremely reluctant to attend the meeting. "They'll just lie," he said, "and then it will get worse." I convinced him that confronting bullies was important, that the school would protect him, that I would support him completely. "This is how we make it stop," I assured him, "by bringing everything into the light." Mark offered to attend the meeting with us, but I declined. I believed I could handle it professionally, drawing on my years of experience mediating student conflicts. I thought my position as a school counselor would give added weight to Ethan's claims. This was yet another miscalculation on my part. The night before the meeting, Ethan could barely eat dinner. His anxiety was palpable, his hands shaking as he pushed food around his plate. "Everything will be better after tomorrow," I promised him. "I believe you, and I'll make sure everyone else does too." I meant those words when I said them. I had no idea how completely I would fail to keep that promise. The meeting took place in the school conference room, a sterile space with fluorescent lighting and a large oval table that suddenly seemed too small for the 10 people gathered around it. Principal Reynolds sat at the head with Ethan and me on one side, and the 3 boys and their parents on the other. The physical arrangement already felt like opposition rather than resolution. Principal Reynolds began with a formal but cautious introduction about the school's commitment to a safe learning environment for all students, while emphasizing the importance of hearing all perspectives and avoiding hasty judgments. The language was familiar to me from my professional work, but sitting on the other side of the table, it suddenly sounded hollow. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he was visibly nervous but determined. His voice shook slightly as he described months of torment, the accidental shoves in the hallway, the destruction of his photography projects, the threatening texts, the social isolation engineered by the 3 boys who warned other students not to befriend him. He mentioned specific incidents with dates and showed photos of his damaged property, including his camera. Throughout Ethan's testimony, I watched the 3 boys. They maintained perfect poker faces, occasionally exchanging glances, but showing no reaction to the allegations. Their composure should have troubled me more than it did. When Ethan finished, there was a moment of silence before Jason's father cleared his throat. "While I appreciate Ethan's perspective," he began in a practiced tone, "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here." What followed was a coordinated defense that left me stunned. For each incident, Ethan described the boys had an alternative explanation: the damaged camera. They weren't even at school that day, and their attendance records could prove it. The threatening texts they showed altered screenshots suggesting Ethan had sent the first aggressive messages and they were merely responding. The physical intimidation, simply accidental contact in crowded hallways that Ethan was overreacting to. Jason's father suggested that Ethan might have damaged his own property for attention, citing a similar case he'd heard about at another school. Connor's mother gently but firmly implied that Ethan's poor social skills were the real issue, offering testimonials from other parents whose children found Ethan odd and off-putting. Tyler's parents brought up our divorce several times, suggesting Ethan was struggling with adjustment and projecting his difficulties onto their son and his friends. Most devastatingly, the boys produced statements from other students who claimed they had never witnessed any bullying. Some even suggested Ethan had tried to insert himself into social situations where he wasn't welcome and became resentful when rejected. These witnesses weren't present at the meeting, just their written statements, which I now suspect were coerced or fabricated. The turning point came when Connor's mother produced a set of screenshots showing what appeared to be Ethan initiating hostile exchanges with the 3 boys. "I think what we're seeing is a case of mutual conflict at best," she said with practiced concern. "Or possibly a troubled young man creating problems and then blaming others." Looking back, I should have questioned these screenshots immediately. I should have asked for digital forensics timestamps context. Instead, I found myself slipping into my professional mode, the counselor who considers all perspectives before making judgments. As the counter-narrative unfolded, I watched Ethan's face. The hope that had been there when we arrived was fading, replaced by disbelief and then a terrible resignation. He looked to me repeatedly, silently, pleading for support, for the unwavering belief I had promised him. Principal Reynolds suggested that perhaps Ethan would benefit from counseling to help him develop more positive peer relationships, and process his feelings about the divorce in healthier ways. He proposed monitoring the situation rather than any concrete action against the alleged bullies. When all eyes turned to me for my response, I made the mistake that would cost me my relationship with my son. Instead of standing firmly with Ethan, I said, "I think we need to consider all possibilities here. If there's been a misunderstanding or mutual conflict, we should address that appropriately." The look Ethan gave me in that moment will haunt me forever. It wasn't anger, which might have been easier to bear. It was the complete collapse of trust. In his eyes, I saw the realization that his last line of defense, his mother, had failed him. The meeting concluded with vague promises to keep lines of communication open and create a more positive environment for all students involved. Nothing concrete, nothing protective, nothing that acknowledged what Ethan had endured. The car ride home was silent. Ethan stared out the window, his body angled away from me as far as the seat would allow. When we were nearly home, he finally spoke, his voice flat. "You were supposed to believe me." "I do believe you," I said defensively. "But as a counselor, I have to be objective and consider all sides. That's how conflict resolution works." "This isn't some random school case," he replied, his voice breaking. "This is my life, and you just let them call me a liar to my face." He went straight to his room when we got home and locked the door. My texts to Mark were frantic, explaining what had happened, trying to justify my approach. "I was being fair to everyone," I wrote. "I was following protocol." Mark's response was simple. "Sometimes being fair isn't what your kid needs. Sometimes they just need you to have their back no matter what." I spent that night outside Ethan's door, occasionally knocking and trying to explain my position. He never answered. I told myself he would understand once he calmed down, that he would see I was trying to handle things professionally and responsibly. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. The next weekend, Ethan asked to stay with Mark as usual. What wasn't usual was his request to extend the stay through the following week. Mark called to check if this was okay with me, and though I felt uneasy, I agreed, thinking Ethan needed space to process what had happened. 1 week turned into 2, then 3. Communication reduced to brief texts answering direct questions. "Yes, I'm doing homework." "No, I don't need anything from home." "School is fine." Each response was minimal, devoid of emotion or detail. After a month of this arrangement, I drove to Mark's house unannounced, determined to speak with Ethan face to face. Mark let me in, but warned me that Ethan had said he wasn't ready to talk. I insisted on trying anyway. Ethan was in the guest room that had become his room, sitting at a desk with headphones on. When he saw me in the doorway, he removed the headphones but didn't get up. "Can we talk?" I asked. "There's nothing to say," he replied, his voice eerily calm. "Ethan, I know you're angry, but I was trying to handle things properly." "You handled things like a counselor, not a mom," he said. "I needed my mom." When I tried to explain again why I took the approach I did, he simply put his headphones back on and turned away. Mark gently suggested I leave, saying Ethan needed more time. In the kitchen, Mark was more direct. "He feels betrayed, Zoe. He feels unsafe with you." "That's ridiculous," I said defensively. "I was being reasonable. Those parents had their side too." "Their side was calling our son a liar," Mark replied. "There shouldn't be two sides when it comes to believing your kid is being hurt." That conversation with Mark was the first crack in my certainty that I had handled things correctly. Still, I clung to my professional training, my belief in fairness and objectivity. It would take much more for me to truly understand what I had done wrong. The next day, Jennifer came over with wine and sympathy. As I poured out the whole story, she listened without interrupting. When I finished with, "I was just trying to be fair," she gave me a long look. "Zoe," she said carefully, "if a student came to you and said they were being bullied, would your first instinct be to doubt them?" "Of course not," I replied. But this was different. There was evidence on both sides. "Was there?" she asked. "Or was there Ethan's consistent story versus a carefully constructed counter-narrative from families with a lot to lose if their kids were exposed as bullies?" Her question stayed with me, planting a seed of doubt about my handling of the situation. But I wasn't ready to fully accept my mistake yet. The situation at school continued to deteriorate. Ethan refused to attend classes where the 3 boys were present. His grades plummeted further. Eventually, Mark arranged for Ethan to transfer to a different school across town closer to his house. The transfer was processed without my signature, which was possible because of our joint custody arrangement, but hurt nonetheless. It was a clear message that decisions about Ethan's welfare were no longer in my hands. As weeks passed with only minimal contact with my son, the reality that I was losing him became impossible to ignore. My desperate attempts to reach out were met with brief, polite responses that felt like communications with a stranger rather than my child. The warmth and connection we once shared had vanished. One Saturday alone in our too-quiet house, I went into Ethan's room, which remained exactly as he had left it. I wasn't snooping exactly, but looking for some connection to my son, some insight into what he had experienced. In the back of his desk drawer, I found a journal I hadn't known he kept. Opening it felt like an invasion of privacy, but my need to understand overwhelmed my scruples. What I read destroyed any remaining belief in the fairness of my approach. Ethan had documented the bullying in detail, day by day, incident by incident. He described the escalating nature of the attacks, the fear he lived with, and most painfully, his multiple attempts to tell me what was happening and my dismissive responses. "Told Mom about the texts today. She said to ignore them and they'd stop. She doesn't understand that ignoring it just makes them try harder to get a reaction. Lost my graphing calculator today. Connor took it from my backpack in gym. Mom thinks I'm just being careless with my things. Doesn't believe anyone would deliberately take my stuff. Asked Mom if I could change schools. She said I was being dramatic and needed to try harder to fit in. Tried to explain, but she got a work call. Never brought it up again." Each entry was like a knife to my heart, documenting not just the bullying, but my repeated failure to hear my son's pleas for help. The final entries before the journal ended were the most devastating. "Meeting at school tomorrow. Mom promises she'll make them stop. She says she believes me. Hope she really does." And then the last entry. "She didn't believe me. Not when it mattered. Stood there while they called me a liar and didn't say anything. What's the point of talking about it anymore?" As if the journal wasn't enough. I found a memory card taped to the back cover. Taking it to my computer, I discovered videos Ethan had secretly recorded of some of the bullying incidents. Shaky, sometimes partial footage showed exactly what he had described: the 3 boys cornering him in empty hallways, destroying his belongings, mocking and threatening him. The videos were dated, proving they had occurred exactly when Ethan said they did, contradicting the boys' alibis that had been accepted so readily in the meeting. Watching those videos was the moment my defenses finally crumbled completely. The evidence had always been there. Ethan had tried to document what was happening to him. He had tried to be heard. And when it mattered most, I had failed him. Armed with this evidence, I returned to the school demanding to see Principal Reynolds. I showed him the videos and insisted on immediate action against the bullies. His response was bureaucratic and defensive. "This material should have been presented during our initial meeting, Miss Parker," he said. "Bringing it forward now after your son has already transferred schools raises questions about the timing and motivation." "The motivation is justice for my son," I insisted. "These boys lied. Their parents lied, and you allowed it to happen. Principal Reynolds suggested that any further complaints would need to go through proper channels, starting with a formal written report that would be reviewed by the district. When I mentioned involving the superintendent, he reminded me that Jason's father served on the committee that advised the superintendent on disciplinary policies. The meeting I requested with the superintendent was delayed multiple times and eventually scheduled for a date 6 weeks away, effectively burying the issue in administrative purgatory. The system I had trusted throughout my career was revealed to be deeply flawed, designed to protect itself and those with power within it rather than vulnerable students like my son. My anger grew as I recognized how completely the system had failed Ethan. When I attempted to contact the bully's parents again with the new evidence, I received a cease and desist letter from Jason's father's attorney claiming harassment and threatening legal action if I continued to defame their son. Mark informed me that Ethan was adjusting well to his new school. He had attended a parent-teacher conference there without inviting me, another painful reminder of my new peripheral role in my son's education. According to Mark, Ethan was slowly rebuilding his interest in photography with the support of an art teacher who recognized his talent. As I processed everything I had learned, a profound shift occurred in my understanding of fairness versus justice. I had been so concerned with being fair to everyone that I had failed to protect the person who needed me most. Neutrality in the face of clear power imbalances doesn't serve justice. It enables further harm. By trying to be objective in a situation that demanded advocacy, I had become complicit in my son's continued victimization. The realization was crushing but necessary. My professional identity as a balanced, objective counselor had directly contradicted what Ethan needed from me as his mother, unconditional belief and fierce protection. The hard truth was that sometimes neutrality favors the oppressor, and in trying not to take sides, I had inadvertently sided against my son. 6 months after Ethan moved in with Mark full-time, my daily routine included sending a text each morning. "Good morning. I love you. I'm here whenever you're ready to talk." Most days the response was simply thanks, or sometimes nothing at all. The brevity hurt, but I clung to the fact that he responded at all. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma and parental alienation, though in my case, the alienation was self-inflicted. Dr. Levine helped me understand the magnitude of my failure, both as a mother and as a counselor. She didn't allow me to wallow in self-pity, but instead focused on accountability and rebuilding if Ethan ever gave me the chance. I took a leave of absence from work, unable to face the hypocrisy of counseling other people's children while I had failed my own so completely. During this time, I learned that the 3 boys who had bullied Ethan received only minimal consequences, a single day of in-school suspension for inappropriate technology use, related to the text messages with no acknowledgement of the broader pattern of bullying. More disturbingly, I began hearing from other parents whose children had experienced similar treatment from the same boys. One mother reached out to thank me for at least trying to speak up, explaining that her daughter had transferred schools the previous year after being targeted by Connor and his friends. These patterns had been allowed to continue because of the boys' parents' influence and the school's unwillingness to confront them. This knowledge sparked something new in me. If I couldn't immediately repair the damage to my relationship with Ethan, I could at least try to prevent other children from experiencing what he had. I connected with anti-bullying organizations and began volunteering, sharing my perspective as both a former school counselor and the parent of a bullying victim. Through this advocacy work, I was forced to confront how my professional training had sometimes contradicted my maternal instinct. I had been taught to remain neutral, to consider all perspectives, to facilitate compromise. But bullying isn't a situation that calls for compromise or neutrality. It requires clear recognition of harm and decisive action to stop it. At a district PTA meeting I attended as part of my advocacy work, I encountered Jason's father. His cold acknowledgement and subsequent whispers to those around him made it clear that I had become something of a pariah in certain school circles. The social consequences of standing up against influential families were real, but they paled in comparison to the cost of my silence. My isolation at work grew as colleagues kept their distance, not wanting to be associated with someone who had challenged the status quo. However, I found unexpected allies in parents of other bullied children who had similarly been dismissed by the system. Together, we began pushing for policy changes and greater accountability. The day Ethan completed his sophomore year at his new school was bittersweet. Mark sent me a photo of Ethan at an end-of-year photography exhibition where his work had been featured. He looked happier than I had seen him in over a year, standing proudly next to his photographs. I wasn't invited to the exhibition, another painful reminder of my exclusion from these important moments. Despite Mark's attempts to mediate, Ethan remained firm in his boundary with me. He would respond to direct communications, but was not ready for in-person meetings or any deeper reconciliation. I respected this boundary, no matter how much it hurt, understanding that forcing the issue would only cause more damage. On Ethan's 16th birthday, I sent a gift through Mark and a card expressing my love and regret. A week later, I received a registered letter from Ethan. My hands trembled as I opened it, both eager for and terrified of its contents. The letter was 5 pages long, written in Ethan's careful handwriting. He explained his decision to cut ties with me in terms that were mature beyond his years, but devastating in their clarity. He wrote about how my betrayal had been worse than the bullying itself, because he had expected safety and belief from me, his mother, when he couldn't find it anywhere else. When you chose to be fair instead of being my mom, he wrote, you taught me that I couldn't count on you to protect me. Home is supposed to be where you're safe, where people believe you even when no one else does. That day in the meeting, I realized I didn't have that with you anymore. The line that broke me completely was his articulation of something I had come to understand too late. Fairness without belief is just another form of abandonment. After reading the letter, I drove to Mark's house in tears, desperate to see Ethan and somehow make him understand how completely I recognized my failure and how desperately I wanted to make amends. Mark met me on the porch, his expression sympathetic but firm. He doesn't want to see you right now, Zoe, he said gently. He put everything he needed to say in that letter. You have to respect that. He's my son, I sobbed. I need to fix this. He's 16, Mark reminded me, old enough to have some say in who he spends time with. Pushing this will only make things worse. The legal reality was stark. At Ethan's age, courts would take his preferences into serious consideration regarding custody and visitation. If I tried to force contact through legal means, I would only damage any chance of future reconciliation. That night was my darkest. I questioned everything about my worth as a mother, my career choices, my fundamental values. The realization that I might never regain Ethan's trust was almost unbearable. I extended my leave of absence to a full medical leave and increased my therapy sessions, recognizing that I needed intensive help to process my guilt without being destroyed by it. Dr. Levine helped me understand that accepting responsibility didn't mean endless self-flagellation. You made a terrible mistake, she said during one particularly difficult session. Now you have 2 choices. Let it define and destroy you, or use it to become the mother and person Ethan might someday be able to trust again. The path forward was painful but clear. I needed to respect Ethan's boundaries completely while remaining consistently available. I needed to demonstrate through actions, not just words, that I had learned from my failure. And perhaps hardest of all, I needed to accept that reconciliation might never come, that some damages cannot be undone, no matter how profound the regret. 1 year after Ethan moved out, I had transformed both personally and professionally. I accepted a position at a different school with a specific focus on advocacy rather than neutral mediation. My approach to student conflicts had fundamentally changed, prioritizing the protection of vulnerable students over bureaucratic fairness that often favored those with more power and resources. I created a parent support group for families of bullied children, providing the guidance and advocacy I had failed to give my own son. The group quickly grew as word spread, revealing how many parents felt unsupported by school systems designed to avoid conflict rather than address it. My advocacy work expanded to include public speaking about the importance of believing children when they report bullying or abuse. I shared my story openly, using my professional background and personal failure to illustrate the dangers of prioritizing procedure over protection. Each presentation was painful but purposeful, a form of atonement that might help other families avoid my mistakes. I collaborated with an educational attorney to create guidelines for more effective anti-bullying policies, addressing the loopholes that had allowed Ethan's bullies to escape meaningful consequences. These guidelines were adopted by several schools in neighboring districts, though Westlake High School notably declined to consider them. Through Mark, I heard that Ethan was thriving in his new environment. His photography had evolved from a hobby to a serious pursuit, with several of his pieces selected for a citywide young artists exhibition. I maintained my practice of sending him letters each month, sharing my life, my continuing love for him, and my respect for his boundaries, never demanding or even requesting a response. Despite the distance between us, I maintained Ethan's room exactly as he had left it, a physical manifestation of the space I was keeping for him in my life should he ever choose to return. Mark mentioned that Ethan had asked for a few more of his things from the house, which I packed carefully and delivered without trying to use the opportunity to force a meeting. There were small signs that the absolute freeze might be thawing ever so slightly. Ethan accepted a birthday gift I sent, a professional camera lens he had mentioned wanting to Mark. He sent a brief text, "Thanks for the lens." 3 words that I read dozens of times, searching for meaning beyond the simple acknowledgement. Mark continued to encourage patience. "Healing takes time," he reminded me during one of our now regular coffee meetings to discuss Ethan. "He's watching to see if you'll respect his boundaries or try to force your way back in." My therapy continued, shifting focus from processing guilt to developing the skills needed to rebuild a relationship with appropriate boundaries and expectations. Dr. Levine helped me understand that if Ethan ever did allow me back into his life, it would not be the same relationship we had before. Trust, once broken so fundamentally, is never fully restored to its original state. At an educational conference focused on student welfare, I was asked to speak about my experience. Without identifying Ethan or the specific school, I shared the complete story of my failure to believe and protect my son, the devastating consequences of that failure, and the lessons I had learned too late. The speech was recorded and shared on the conference's social media platforms. 2 days later, I received a text from Ethan. "I saw your talk." My heart raced as I carefully considered my response. I wanted to pour out everything I felt, but knew that would overwhelm him and possibly push him away again. Instead, I wrote simply, "Thank you for watching it. Everything I said is true. I failed you, and I'm so sorry." There was no immediate response, but a week later, another text arrived, "Working on a new photography series for school. It's about communication and miscommunication." This began a tentative pattern of occasional texts, primarily initiated by Ethan, focusing on his photography and school projects. I responded with interest and support, careful not to push for more than he was offering. Each message was a small bridge being rebuilt between us, fragile but hopeful. When Ethan was accepted to a prestigious photography program at a local college for the following year, Mark called to tell me the news. He mentioned that he might need help with expenses. Mark said, "I told him we would both contribute." "Of course," I said immediately. "Whatever he needs." The fact that Ethan was willing to accept financial support from me felt significant, another small step towards some new form of relationship. The pivotal moment came nearly 2 years after our estrangement began. Ethan agreed to meet me for coffee at a neutral location. I arrived early, my stomach in knots, simultaneously terrified of saying the wrong thing and desperately hopeful for some path to reconciliation. When Ethan walked in, the physical changes in him were striking. At 18, he had grown taller, his features more defined, looking so much like Mark at that age. But it was the confidence in his posture that affected me most, the sense that he was comfortable in his own skin in a way he hadn't been before. Our conversation was awkward at first, careful and constrained on both sides. But as we sipped our drinks, something shifted. Ethan spoke about his photography, his new school, his plans for college. I listened, asking questions, but careful not to dominate the conversation. When there was a natural lull, Ethan looked directly at me for what felt like the first time in years. "I'm still hurt by what happened," he said quietly. "I don't think I'll ever forget how it felt when you didn't stand up for me." "I don't expect you to forget," I replied, fighting back tears. "I will regret it for the rest of my life. All I can say is that I learned from it, though the cost of that lesson was far too high." Ethan nodded slowly. "I've been seeing a therapist. He's helped me understand that what happened wasn't just about that one meeting. It was about all the times before when I tried to tell you something was wrong and you didn't really hear me." His insight was painful, but accurate. The meeting had been the breaking point, but the foundation had been cracking long before that with each dismissed concern and minimized complaint. "You're right," I acknowledged. "I was so caught up in being a counselor and being fair that I forgot to be your mom first. That's not an excuse. There is no excuse, but I want you to know I understand it now." By the end of our hour together, we had agreed to try small steps toward rebuilding some kind of relationship. Ethan wasn't ready for family dinners or holidays, but he was willing to meet occasionally and continue our text conversations. Before we parted, he pulled out his phone and showed me his photography portfolio, a gesture of trust that brought me to tears. His work was beautiful, haunting images that explored themes of isolation and connection. I recognized his talent had grown tremendously nurtured by teachers who had supported him when I had failed to. In the months that followed, our tentative reconnection continued. The school where I now worked implemented new anti-bullying policies based partly on my advocacy, creating clearer pathways for reports and stronger consequences for confirmed bullying. It was a small victory in the larger battle to create safer spaces for vulnerable students. I learned through Mark that one of Ethan's former bullies, Connor, had reached out to apologize. The apology came after Connor's younger sister experienced bullying at her school, giving him a new perspective on the harm he had caused. Ethan had accepted the apology but maintained his distance, a boundary I completely understood and respected. As Ethan's high school graduation approached, I carefully avoided assuming I would be invited. When the invitation arrived in the mail, simple and formal, but undeniably intentional, it felt like a precious gift. The card included a handwritten note. "I'd like you to be there, Ethan. Our relationship will never be what it was before. The innocent trust of childhood has been replaced by something more cautious, more mindful of boundaries. But there is a relationship, and for that, I am profoundly grateful. I've come to accept that some damage cannot be undone. My failure to believe Ethan when he needed me most created a fracture that will always be part of our story. But around that fracture, something new can grow, something different, but potentially valuable in its own way. My definition of parenting has fundamentally changed. Being a parent isn't about being fair or objective or always getting things right. It's about being the safe place, the person who believes first and questions later, who stands with your child, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. It's about recognizing that your child's trust is sacred and once broken, may never be fully restored to what it was. Ethan's graduation is next week. He'll be attending college in the fall, pursuing his passion for photography with the support of both his parents. He isn't ready for more than our careful, limited interactions, but he is willing to try. That willingness is more than I deserve and everything I pray for. If there's one message I could share with every parent watching this, it's this. When your child tells you they're being hurt, believe them first. Investigation, fairness, objectivity. All of these can come later. In that crucial moment, when they're vulnerable enough to tell you they're suffering, belief is the only appropriate response. Because fairness without belief isn't fairness at all. It's abandonment when they need you most. Has my story resonated with you today? Perhaps you've experienced something similar, either as a parent who missed the signs or as a child whose truth wasn't believed. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story has helped you see parenting or trust in a new light, please like and subscribe to support more honest conversations about the most difficult parts of family relationships. And if you know someone who might benefit from this message, sharing could help them avoid the painful lesson I had to learn. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, in the choice between being fair and being your child's safe harbor, choose to be their safe harbor every time.